Great. Yeah, so welcome to our last Terra Talk of this cohort. Our cohort that's happening right now is called the Narwhals. We name everyone after endangered species. And we are, I'm gonna do intros in a moment. And let's just see, is Liam or Britt here? I'm just gonna assign someone to help me let in people as they come. Let's see. Liam. It appears that Britt and Liam are not here, maybe. So I'm just gonna keep letting people in as they come. Okay. Well, I want to get started because I want to make the most of this next 57 minutes or more. Sometimes if we go over a couple minutes and if it's okay with the speakers, there's just tons of great questions to get to. But this panel today is titled "The Future of Energy." So it's a big and a bold and a broad title. But we're really excited to have three guests coming in to speak with us about various dimensions of the clean energy transition. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then they'll each have 10 to 12 minutes to share a little bit about what they do, what they see as the future of energy in their area of work, and then how they got there. And then we'll have like an open discussion where we can link the three conversations and all of your questions in the second half of today's panel. So I'll start by introducing Cecilia. Cecilia is a senior researcher at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. Cecilia, if you're up there in the top, but can you wave if people can't see you? There's Cecilia. She researches clean energy policies and developments in China. She holds a master's and PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley. And we started our grad program at Berkeley together in 2014. So we learned together at Berkeley for like 5 years. It was a great experience. And so next I'll introduce Holmes Hummel, who founded Clean Energy Works to accelerate investments in the clean energy economy with inclusive financing. And as the champion for the pay-as-you-save system, Dr. Hummel led Clean Energy Works to win the FIRE Award for High Impact Innovation at the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Future of Energy Summit. Previously, Dr. Hummel served as the Senior Policy Advisor in the Department of Energy's Office of Policy and International Affairs from 2009 to 2013. In addition to prior work with energy innovators in Silicon Valley, Dr. Hummel earned a doctorate from Stanford University for interdisciplinary research on energy technology scenarios that achieve 100% clean energy for all. Here, I'm going to admit 2 more people. Great. And Amol Phadke is a scientist, lead of the India Research Program, and deputy of the International Energy Analysis Department, Energy Analysis and Environmental Impacts Division at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. His research and technical support activities broadly focus on energy technology, economics, markets, and regulation. And he recently co-authored the 2035 report, which summarizes a pathway to 90% clean energy in the US by 2035 using existing technologies, which received a lot of media attention and media support from Lindsay Hamilton at Climate Nexus, who was a guest speaker with us earlier in the course. So we are delighted to have you all here. And I'm going to first turn it over to Cecilia to get us started and kick off the panel.
Sure, thank you, Lainey. It's really great to be here and hope to chat more with all of the fellows. And so, I want to talk about the future of energy in China and China's role in affecting the future of energy around the world. So I've been studying and trying to understand energy, climate, and environmental policy in China for almost 10 years now, ever since I went there as a Fulbright Fellow back in 2011. And, for the most part, to answer the questions that I have about China, I mix field work, interviews, study trips there with more quantitative economic analysis that I can do from anywhere, which is useful these days. But the thing is, over the past 10 years, things have changed a lot in China. I think the one constant there is rapid change. And so, but one thing remains the same, which is that China is just so important for the global energy system and the global climate system. China is arguably the world's most populous country, but it's definitely the largest energy consumer. And China runs on coal. So it consumes half of the world's coal, a little more than half of the world's coal, and it produces almost half of the world's coal, which means that that shortfall is made up of imports from nearby countries. And almost 70% of the electricity in China is generated from coal. And about 61% of its primary energy use is coal. So there's a lot of coal, there's a lot of domestic reserves there. And as a result, China has the highest CO2 emissions in the world. It surpassed the US almost a decade ago in terms of its annual CO2 emissions. And the majority of these emissions are attributable to coal combustion for power generation, as well as coal combustion for heavy industry like cement, steel, and so on. So China's other CO2 emissions are increasingly coming from transportation, especially personal vehicles, as well as non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture and industry. But when I think about decarbonization in China, and I think a lot of others are the same, I still think first of coal. And electrification, can't be the answer alone in the Chinese context, because China still has a lot of hard to electrify industrial production, like cement and steel and so on. So I wanted to talk today about China's most recent big announcement, which some of you may have heard about, which is the new goal to be carbon neutral by 2060. And so this announcement was sort of strategically timed. It's feeding into the UN negotiations on climate change and represents China's newest commitment in that venue. But I also think it was strategically timed to come before the US election. And this reflects China's ongoing ambition to sort of take on the global mantle of climate leadership, where the US has kind of been stepping back in recent years. And I think this new goal has received a lot of attention. I think it's really remarkable because previously China's energy and climate goals have usually been expressed as intensity targets. So, we aim to achieve this amount of energy intensity in our economy by this year. But that left a lot of room for growth and development. But this new carbon neutrality goal, a lot of people think that that will entail absolute caps on emissions for maybe the first time when it comes to China's climate and energy policy. And this would have been definitely unheard of maybe 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, to have such a bold target. However, 2060 is still very far away. The current leaders of China won't be there anymore in 2060, hopefully. So the true impact of this announcement, has yet to be seen. And it'll really come down to what China does in the next 10 years. And so, the previous goal that China had been organizing a lot of its climate policy around was to peak its CO2 emissions by 2030. But a lot of scholars thought that that was going to happen anyways, with or without additional climate policies, because of the changing structure of China's economy. It's been moving away from heavy industry and towards services and becoming more, of a middle income country. But this new goal means that CO2 emissions may peak before 2030, and that carbon neutrality will entail a lot of sort of shifting around of what's been happening in the suite of energy and climate policies that China is pursuing. And right now, China's 14th five-year plan is being formulated. So these are the 5-year guiding strategies that China organizes a lot of its policy arcs around. And so we're all waiting to see, what new targets they might set for specific sectors, and potentially some kind of absolute emissions cap. So I can go into more of the specific, in policies or industries that China is doing, but I also want to talk about how these new climate goals are very much at odds with what China is doing overseas. So you may have heard about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a new name for a sort of old phenomenon, which is China facilitating its domestic companies investing overseas. And so there's been, billions of dollars dispersed through overseas Chinese investment. A lot of it going to developing countries, but some of it in partnership with places in the Europe or even the US. But the interesting thing about the Belt and Road Initiative is that most of that investment has gone into the energy sector. And most of the investment in the energy sector has gone into electric power specifically. There's other, upstream production, oil and gas, but the biggest share has gone into electric power. And then the biggest share of electric power investment has gone into coal. And so, the question of China and decarbonization comes down to coal. If China is sort of actively facilitating the build out of coal power plants in nearby countries, especially in South Asia and Southeast Asia, the question is, that doesn't really square with what they're doing at home in terms of increasingly stringent climate regulation. And of course, overseas emissions are not accounted for in national emissions accounts or regulation strategies, but it might even be linked. As China starts to regulate its own coal industry and phase it out, a lot of these domestic large state-owned enterprises need new markets. And so a lot of people think that the Belt and Road Initiative is partially a way to help China keep these companies afloat by accessing overseas markets. Now, a more optimistic take, I think it's more complicated than that. A more optimistic take might be that China is poised to facilitate a global clean energy transition by sharing all of its experience on, building low-cost solar panels and wind turbines and helping those expand around the world. Now, this is a really big and complicated topic and one that we're basically working on every day at my current center. So I'd be happy to talk about that. But basically, it's really clear that, China's working on an energy transition at home. It has a big role to play in global energy development, especially over the next decade. And so the question is, now, what can you do to make China's energy transition happen? So, I kind of thought of like 3 pillars for that. So, you all can get involved in analysis, advocacy, or innovation. On the analysis side, we still don't know a lot about how this carbon neutrality goal is going to be achieved specifically. There need to be sector level plans. There needs to be consideration of policies and how they might interact. So there's a lot of modeling work. It sounds like Amol and Holmes have done this kind of work maybe for other regions. A lot of that needs to happen for China now and be communicated to policymakers. So in terms of advocacy, we all need to do our job in holding China accountable to achieving its domestic goals, as well as continuing to put attention and pressure on what's been going on with their investments in coal overseas. So there's a lot of think tanks and NGOs that are engaged with that, both within China and outside of it. And then finally, innovation. This is not really my area, but there's a lot to be done on technology deployment, innovative business models to facilitate more renewable energy development overseas and link that to Chinese investment. So I'll stop there and happy to chat more later.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cecilia. And I'm going to keep it going to the other 2 panelists and then open it all up to questions, because I'm hoping the questions can integrate between these 3. And I think that the talks will also integrate with each other. So hold your questions. You can write them down in the chat. And Cecilia, if you see any, you can pick them off if you choose. But Amol, I'm going to go over to you and then over to Holmes. So yeah, take it away.
All right. Excited to be here. And excited to be talking to you, you all. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of cover some very exciting developments on technology and how it impacts the thinking on climate mitigation all around the world. I'm going to then discuss its implications on the US and cover some tidbits on India. I do have slides, but I think I'm not going to share them because maybe you can look at them offline.
Yes, you can send them to me after, or if it's relevant to a question, you can pull one up. But anyways, yeah, go right ahead.
So, so I have been, just a little bit about myself. I'm currently at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm originally from India, and I work at the intersection of kind of technology, policy, and political economy. So, in terms of the big picture, there is a lot of what has happened essentially is that the costs of clean technology has dropped much faster than anybody had anticipated. So for example, if you look at a few key technologies such as solar, wind, and storage, whatever the cost project, so those costs have dropped about, since 2010, those costs have dropped about 80 to 85%. Which is phenomenal, right? And more importantly, those costs have dropped much faster than anticipated, meaning just the projections made a couple of years ago, say 3 years ago, of what the costs would be in 2030, those have already arrived, which is a very exciting development, and also for you folks to contribute, because all the analysis which was done like 4 years ago, 3 years ago, is all outdated. It's all like, it's not valid. I mean, the field it's like become like software, like you can't be saying, oh, like using an iPhone from 4 years ago. I mean, I still use it, but it's not cool. So it's same thing has happened to energy analysis, right? So how does this impact, say, our assessments of what is possible? So based on these trends, we basically started looking at the US, and the question was that how fast the US power sector can decarbonize without increasing electricity bills for consumers. Because if you look at the previous analysis, essentially looked at what's the pathway for decarbonization by 2050, and that analysis was primarily focused on 100% electrification and a lot of esoteric discussion on like how would you get the last 10%. We said, okay, the technology is here now, how fast can you do this stuff given current technology? So we basically looked at 90% clean electricity in the US by 2035. And we found that you could actually reliably decarbonize US power system and reach 90% clean electricity by 2035 without increasing consumer costs. And the argument we are making in the sector now is that we are letting climate destroying our planet for no good reason. See, 10 years ago, you could have argued, oh, yes, we know climate change is here and blah, 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 but it's really expensive to transition. And it's so there is some reason at least not to do this stuff. But what we are finding is that there is no good reason in terms of ultimate consumers of not to act aggressively. So, and this is not just happening on, so this is, I think, the shift in the field in thinking that needs to happen. People are still focused on 2050. People are still focused on esoteric stuff. I think the appeal to this group is and we can help you. Like basically say, 2050 is a nice thing to say, and it's important. It's like I saying to my mom, I'm going to have a 6-pack on my 50th birthday while still ordering like paneer tikka masala tonight. So that's what is happening. So I think we really need to change the thinking in the field to shift the thinking on targets from 2050 to more intermediate. And they can be a little less aggressive because those targets are going to affect investment decisions in the next 10 years. Because if, as a field, if we make wrong investment decisions in the next 10 years, no matter how lofty goals we can have for 2050 and 2060, we are going to be stuck with an inhabitable planet. So the first line of thinking is that the technology has moved very rapidly, And so you could do a lot of this stuff and reach 90% or 80% of the way of where we need to be using existing technology. So this is just to give you an example on the power sector. The other big sector all around the world, the next big sector is transport. And this is where stuff has moved even more dramatically. Again, battery costs have dropped by 85%. So all these things about, oh, electric vehicles didn't have enough range, electric vehicles cannot be charged fast enough, electric trucks are too heavy. Those are 3-year-old studies and assumptions are no longer valid. So just to give you an example, now electric cars with current technology can put on a range of 100 to 150 miles in 5 minutes. That's where the technology is today. Electric cars have been introduced over 500-mile range. I mean, they are, like, if you look at the production lines, they are in that pipeline. So what's interesting and if you look at trucking, which is a very big sector all around the world. So 50% of the emissions from transport, oil emissions, are for buses and trucks. And our assessments are showing that you could actually do electric trucks, and Holmes has worked on electric buses. So that field is also transforming very rapidly. So I think those assumptions are no longer valid. So one needs to take a fresh look in the US, in China, and in India. So then let me come to, if the technology has changed so rapidly, what are the most critical decisions on the horizon in the next 5 to 10 years that will impact the trajectory of climate, and what is at play in those decisions? So if you look at power, the key decision in emerging economies in the next 5 years is investment in new coal power plants. And a lot of analysis is beginning to show that building new coal plants is not only highly damaging to climate, but it's not cost effective. And that thinking needs to be changed in the field. So just to give you an example of the scale, US has about 200 to 250 gigawatts of coal still outstanding in its power mix. China is planning to build 250 gigawatts of coal in the next 5 years. That's a bloody important decision. Similarly, there is a pipeline of 50 to 100 gigawatts of coal in India. That is in the pipeline. Similarly, China and India, especially China, is investing in coal in other emerging economies. So one cannot question coal just because it's environmentally bad. Because the argument is that countries need to develop, they need the power, they need cheap power. So unless there is a very concrete alternative on cost and reliability provided, that build out is going to happen. So the challenge to our community and to this group is to articulate those alternatives which actually provide the same level of service to consumers. Don't ask them to sacrifice anything because human beings don't really care about environment. We just want our energy services, and if at all we can save climate, we may save climate. But so that's a huge decision on power sector that is hanging in the balance in the next 5 years. The other big decision that is hanging in the grand scheme of things is how rapidly one deploys electric vehicles. And in that, the private sector is doing its thing, the battery costs are coming down, but public policy has an incredibly important role, because all the development of electric vehicles really depends on development of charging infrastructure, development of financing, development of business models. And this is where if India and China build more factories to produce more diesel and gasoline vehicles in the next 5 to 10 years, you will have a lot of kind of stranded assets. So power and transport, and of course building. So those are kind of the important decisions that will really impact the trajectory in the important investment decisions in the next 5 to 10 years. But what is exciting is that the technology has moved very rapidly. So the climate space has suddenly become very interesting, because there is enough maneuvering space that with a little bit of nudge, you could in fact really turn the tide. And that brings me to the last kind of question about what's the political economy of all this, and how does this link to environmental justice and equity. And those issues are important in it themselves, but if they are not kind of addressed in the same energy policy sphere, it will basically not lead to a just transition, but it will basically not lead to a transition. And that kind of has three aspects. First is that how do you compensate people who are currently employed in the fossil industry while you make the transition? So how does that look? So for example, Coal India Limited is the largest public sector employer in India. It has significant political influence. So while we are talking all nice things about clean energy transition, what is the pathway for those workers? Is a very important aspect. The second aspect is that a lot of policy priorities on climate also lead to enhancement of environmental justice, enhancement of equity. The question is that how do we prioritize clean energy policy so that it's not just focused on climate, but it also is able to enhance other equity objectives rapidly. I'll give you one example. If you look at the burden of air pollution everywhere in the world and in the US, it falls kind of disproportionately on low income and poor communities, or low income and minority communities. A lot of it is diesel pollution. So if I have a $200 billion worth of subsidy to give to electric vehicles, maybe I should be prioritizing electric trucks because those are diesel based. Those disproportionately affect poor and minority communities. So it's very interesting to find what is that intersection of highest impact climate activities and highest impact environmental justice opportunity. What does that intersection look like? And how would you actually properly compensate people who will be negatively affected in a transition? So I think that's kind of the third important issue. So just to summarize, I think what has happened, the good news is that the technology has moved very rapidly, which has made all the work I did last 20 years is outdated, mostly outdated. I mean, some of it is valid, but mostly it is outdated. So I think that gives you opportunity, folks like you, to come and contribute. And that's an opportunity to move the targets from 2050 to 2030, 2035. That's the first point, that technologies move. The second point is that it's very important to look at decisions in the next 10 years and figure out from a climate perspective, what are the most important decisions. There are a lot of things you guys could choose to work on, but it's important to figure out what's going to really matter. And I think there is a lot of interesting work to be done there. So for example, coal power plants investments, providing alternatives to that, heavy duty transport. There are high impact sectors and one should focus on. That's the second point, prioritization. And the third point is that we cannot do energy policy in vacuum or think about climate in vacuum. It clearly intersects with environmental justice, people's employment, and that's kind of the Green New Deal type thinking, is that you have to link all these issues and see what is the highest impact intersection of those issues to make those contributions. So overall, I think it's a this is the time. This is the only time we have. That's it. I think that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts and summarizing them and sort of speaking directly to what we all here can do. I think that's so helpful and important to point out, because I mean, one of them, like whether or not people are working in energy, but just articulating the pathway so that it is so clear, I think is something that like all global citizens can and should be better equipped to accomplish and to, you know, carry out in our own communities. Okay, so we're gonna go over to Holmes and then we're gonna open it up for Q&A. And similarly, if you have any direct questions for Amol, you can put them in the chat and, you know, he can look at them, but also, yeah, listen and we can get to them all, as many as we can in the open discussion phase. Over to you, Holmes.
Friends, it's a privilege to be included in the school. I'm very interested in the exercise and exploration of massive online learning and international diplomacy through education, as well as the science diplomacy that you see both Cecilia and Amol being a part of now. I have in my career also been an adjunct professor at Stanford, teaching courses on whole systems thinking for energy solutions and racial equity in the energy sector. And a lot of the things that you've heard from both of the prior speakers are going to resonate with the remarks that I prepared for you today. I am going to use visual aids because for me, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I want to move swiftly to a place where we can be in dialogue and engagement. Most importantly, I'm interested in your critical thinking and interrogation of some of the things that I will share with you out of the journey that Lainey invited me to share. So I hope that you can see my screen now. And the theme of it is perspectives on a journey toward the future of energy, which was the topic of today's remarks. Let me see if I can advance it. So my pursuit of the future of energy started a quarter century ago. I was a teenager then, and I led a college team from upstate New York to compete in a government-sponsored contest to see who could build the fastest lightweight machine that would hurl down the highway from Indianapolis to Colorado. Looking back on that from the vantage point of 2020, I can see that what we were involved in was a research and development project that was actually motivated by American national security interests to get off of oil. We'd just been waging a war in Iraq 4 years earlier, and the federal government was paying us to combine solar power, batteries, electric drivetrains, and lightweight materials to see if we had a better future. Of course we did, and it was a ton of fun, but we were so early in the commercialization phase, it was very difficult to see the immediate gratification that 1,000 engineers did want. A few among them actually turned out to be among the founding executives of Tesla Motors. And 15 years later, we had fully commercialized electric vehicles on the road in the United States. Now, working with technology is one vector that you have for participating in the turning of the tide. So I'm raising for you New Energy Nexus, the largest international network of incubators and accelerators, where you can find local partners that are already harboring the startups of today that are part of the big stories of tomorrow. This map will take you to continents around the country, around the world, finding in your country where there are incubators and accelerators with startups that need your ideas, that are seeking to reward you for your courage and ingenuity, and are ready to connect you with other people who are just as ambitious, determined, and looking for connection. To move forward through my journey, the next thing that I turned to was renewable energy and commercializing the deployment of renewable energy everywhere, especially in places where commercial access to electricity was sparse. That included South Africa in the wake of the end of apartheid. Here's a picture from my younger years working at a health clinic where they were installing solar systems to provide resilience for critical loads, which is a theme that we have today in the climate adaptation policy space. But that was more than 20 years ago. One of the things that really motivated me about renewable energy and distributed energy solutions was that it seemed to be an imperative for a part of a clean energy future that we would not be able to overlook. And the people who are working on those problems had to be a part of those with a voice at the table in order to arrive at a least cost solution that was affordable and accessible to all. One of the challenges that we faced, however, was just sheer scale. Research and development could do so much, but only so much. The federal government could pour billions of dollars every year into research and development and projects like the one that I was dispatched to in South Africa, but they would only get us to the beginning of this part of the journey. The innovation diffusion curves that actually give us the race against time that Amol was already speaking to. How fast can we actually penetrate markets that are dominated by fossil fuels and nuclear power today in order to provide a safe, secure, accessible, clean energy set of solutions tomorrow? And compressing this time frame down to the timestamps that Amol has in mind is something that will mark history for what we know of as the Anthropocene. This is what's happening in the Anthropocene, the explosion of the carbon bomb in the atmosphere and the humanitarian response through international science diplomacy and policy for markets that can respond to it in time. Now, putting that speed and scale question into perspective, I'm going to show you a picture that's quintessentially American, but I recognize we are in an international school with an international audience. I lack your domain expertise, but I'm going to guess with a very strong hunch that most industrialized countries have a graph that looks like this with only slightly compressed time frame, where the United States might have started using fossil fuels in the mid 1800s at a very large scale, where other nation states were moving into that era in the early 1930s to 50s. So their graph will be compressed. The top line stories for this graph are that fossil fuels are the majority of everything in the history of the industrial economy of the United States. And even today, it accounts for more than 80% of the energy consumption. So for those people like me who are committed and deeply convicted that we have to have a clean energy future, the humility in this graph is that that is the portion of our economy that is powered by renewable energy today. And that the timestamp of 2050, long and far off as Amol convinces us it should be, puts us on a death-defying path of market penetration and disposal of working assets, which means that in addition to persuading people to no longer invest in assets we intend to strand, we also have to drive to the curb assets that are working today. And that's an uncomfortable kind of quest, but we lay it at the feet of our policymakers. So I was a participant in that process for 4 years as the senior policy advisor in the Office of Policy and International Affairs at the United States Department of Energy. And in 2011, for the first time ever, we articulated for the audience of the American people that pay for the Department of Energy's annual billions of dollars of work, a strategy for how we would be deploying those resources in order to achieve that clean energy future in its vision. We broke the portfolio down to these 6 strategies. You are all fluent and literate, so I won't read them aloud, but I actually think there's something very robust and resilient about these 6 strategies. If you try them on for size today, they fit. And they fit for most economies, no matter what your resource portfolio may be. One thing that I learned as the senior policy advisor in implementing those 6 strategies was that almost every single agency in the federal government had a role to play. It wasn't true that the Department of Energy was the mule with a yoke, and that with a merely $3 billion a year, they were supposed to transform the economy. Oh no. In fact, it was the charge of the senior policy advisor at the Department of Energy to activate the authorities of every federal agency and policymakers at every level of jurisdiction, including with our international counterparts through formations like the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is by itself a fantastic and fascinating platform to explore for international science cooperation. But this is intended as a slide to encourage you that no matter where you are, there is a network of jurisdictions and a complex of interagency engagement at multi-jurisdictional levels that you actually can engage and have influence in a way that marks time. Now, Amol already spoiled this graph, because he told you that the markets are on the way to destroy the value proposition of new investments in fossil fuels and to strand those people who are continuing to dispatch fossil assets uneconomically, even when there's must-run cleaner facilities nearby. This kind of graph, published in 2020, is an unrelenting reminder that there's no turning back. These curves are not going to reverse. They are not going to suddenly spike upward. We've turned down an irreversible path towards levelized cost of electricity that should reward anyone who is investing in portfolios that are cleaner than the ones we have today and retire early those that are dirty. Now, that said, I want to point out that greening the grid is easier said than done when you look at what you actually have to do to achieve those 90% clean energy futures that Amol talked about. Just again, taking the United States as a proxy and not as a projection for the whole world, but as a proxy. If you wanted to reach 1990 levels or 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, which was an out-of-date target, I might add, this study by the Brattle Group showed that even if we did turn our entire grid to 100% clean electricity and fast, even much faster than this graph would describe, we would not even make it halfway. We wouldn't even make it halfway. Most people think about greening the grid and think that's the big deal. But in fact, heating and transportation is at least that much of a problem on the other side. And that's why the title across the slide is Green the Grid plus Electrify Everything. And now greening the grid just got to be double the size of the challenge. Because the grid itself, even if it's vastly diversified in its architecture, still has to be able to serve twice as many critical loads. Now, I work on that, and this is the home stretch, at the grid edge, which is to say, among those technologies where the cost curve is hammering down, the ones that are most compelling to the analysis that I've been able to do in my career show me that investments at the grid edge have the biggest bang for the buck, and they provide the best security and the best assurance and the best affordability overall. But we face another challenge, which is that most of those solutions, whether it's air-to-air heat pumps or electric buses or electric vehicles or on-site solar or demand response and flexible loads or energy efficiency, all of them on the customer side of the meter are difficult to capitalize because the people on the other side of the meter are presumed by energy policy analysts to be giving over their consumer credit to a national interest without permission. And this is an appropriation that is inappropriate to assume. We don't have any evidence that it's true. We don't have any evidence that consumers will willfully hand over their consumer credit lines in the name of national interest. And as a result, we don't get the market penetrations as fast as we need. Remembering that curve I told you earlier, we need to be able to compress. I've felt gripped by this challenge since my time at the Department of Energy, when one of my challenges was to steward policy during the recovery of the last recession. And in that time period, lead the finance working group for the Department of Energy. And we found that these three questions disqualified a majority of the Americans from participating in consumer finance of energy upgrades that would actually serve them well, but they wouldn't have the option to access. So we started to look at other analogs, including those that had come from India. And in India, the pay-as-you-save system had already shown us that we could commercialize the distribution of 75 million to 100 million LED light bulbs for $1.50 with a cost recovery of 10 cents per month on the utility bill. And it worked. And our question was, if it can work there in India at 10 cents per month for a light bulb, can it work for everything that we need on the customer side of the meter? And as Lainey was just introducing me, that work is related to pay as you save. First, demonstrated at a large scale for individual devices in India, and now in the United States, implemented in 8 states for whole building upgrades. And now we're looking at expansion into on-site solar, electric vehicle chargers, and other types of technologies. It works like this. The utility draws in low-cost capital and pays for those upgrades on the customer side of the meter, assigning them to a site and not to a person, so that the utility can recover the cost for their investment at that site without having to indebt the customer who lives there. That means everyone can play. And it's directly responsive to Amol's call for justice and inclusion in a clean energy economy. What we've seen from the data from the field is that when everyone can play, customer eligibility surges to addressable markets that are double the size that the companies are working with now. And when they're offered the opportunity for that EV charger, the rooftop solar upgrade, or the building energy efficiency upgrade, especially the data for energy efficiency shows us that they say yes the majority of the time, which is 500% higher rate of acceptance than other types of financing solutions. And when they say yes, the risk exposure they face is so much lower that they say yes to bigger projects with deeper savings. And when they take on that upgrade, the utility's ability to commit the capital and recover its cost is so much better than the banking sector that the risk exposure is 10 times lower. I'll skip the talking points here, but just to point out that these first three factors are multiplying. When you double the size of the addressable market and people say yes twice as often, and when they say yes to their projects, they're twice as big, that's 2 times 2 times 2. That's an exponential increase in the rate of capital deployment. And that's what we're looking for to beat the clock. I've hit the home stretch, but I hope in my journey, I've showed you 4 different types of strategies for participating in a path to climate stabilization that might appeal to any one of you for all of your varied interests and backgrounds. And whether you choose one of these 4 strategies or another, I also wanted to show you a list of disciplines that any of you may have in your educational background or the climate school may be able to help facilitate your advancement in. All of these disciplinary domains of expertise have a role in the institutes like the ones where Cecilia and Amol work, but also in every community, every province, every national government, every company, every startup, and every science institution you've ever heard of. Everybody has a place.
Awesome. That was such an incredibly energized journey through your experience and all these amazing ways that we can plug into the clean energy transition. Thank you so much, Holmes. That was fabulous. So I'm going to open it up now to everyone's questions. I know there's been some questions coming in on the chat and people have been answering them, but if you have questions for our 3 panelists as a group or any specific individual, please just put your name or a +1 in the chat and I'll just call on you to share. Or if you don't have good connectivity, you can write it and I'll read it aloud. But yeah, this has been super energizing. And I just really appreciate the way that each of the panelists have spoken directly to our audience. And that is really what we're all about here at Terra, is like catalyzing everyone's human potential to transition into climate action work that taps into your existing areas of expertise. We have an amazing diversity of skills here in the room, the Zoom room. Okay, let's see. Florian, I'm going to read your question since, yeah. So it's for Holmes. Did you thought to a model to accelerate the adoption of technology? Florian, I might have to ask you to clarify your question.
Yeah, no problem. So Holmes, thank you for your presentation. So one question I had is, the model you use is really going through the utilities to encourage consumers to add insulation to their homes and add new technologies. I was wondering, did you think to also other models that could be complementary that provide services to consumers, but more led by the private sector?
Florian, thank you for the question and the critical thinking about it. I'm certainly of a position that there are many solutions and we should seek to interrogate and develop them. One thing that I do know is that at least in the United States, it is a private market solution for utilities to capitalize distributed resources with a path to ownership for the customer. It is not welcome for the utilities to expand their monopoly in a way that would be described as an abuse of market power. So that is not welcome. But it is welcome for the utilities to capitalize equipment on the customer side of the meter in a way to accelerate investment that they might not undertake themselves, and also assure them a path to ownership, which is the antidote to the abuse of market power of a monopoly. So it is a private market solution. It is not the only private market solution. So the second thing I will say to engage you is that all of the other private market solutions that we know about, and that includes my colleagues from the Department of Energy who have been interrogating this question for a decade every single day after breakfast, is that there is no other solution that we know of that can qualify individuals as counterparties if they do not have a sufficiently strong credit history, income, or proof of land ownership. And in the United States, those three questions will disqualify more than half of all of our households, which is politically untenable. And it is a part of the production of the clean energy divide that has produced this incredible surge around the Green New Deal. It is a response among people who lead in communities of color and low-income communities that they will not be denied a position in the clean energy future, and they're demanding inclusive solutions, which is why working on solutions like Pay As You Save has been very gratifying. It appears to be responsive.
Great question, and yeah, great response. There was a question up above that I think Varun directed to all of our panelists. So I'm just going to read that one out. What is the fastest that the planet can achieve the energy transition to net carbon neutrality? And I think Amol touched on it in the chat. But Cecilia, if you want to share your views on that, what's the fastest we could get there?
Well, I think, if China sticks to its goal of 2060, I think that means that perhaps there could be hope for globally in net carbon neutrality, because some countries are much better poised than China to achieve carbon neutrality, and many are less well poised. So hopefully, let's say in my lifetime.
Nice. Yeah. And Amol, did you, I sort of, the chat has gotten a little cluttered. Did you share your thoughts on that in there, or do you want to just summarize them out loud as well?
Yeah, I guess I would say that more broadly, I think there is what kind of building on what Holmes has said is that clean energy transition is a technology question, but it also a political economy question. And this is where what Holmes has been saying is how would you actually make the political economy work for a clean energy transition is, in my opinion, is going to be the linchpin of how fast we can do. I mean, I can do modeling which shows you could do this by 2050, but that's useless. I mean, that's important, but we have to figure these things out. And I think, so I think the challenge to this group, in addition to technology, is to think about some disruptive political economy ideas. And I think what Holmes is working on is, from a technology perspective, I don't really believe in distributed, I'm sorry to say. Like I think it's much better to build large grid scale power and deliver the electricity, but it completely misses the point of why those politicians are not making those decisions, because there is lack of participation. There is a lack of these issues being on the ballot. And I think we can't think about energy policy as a technical question. It's very important to figure out the technical solutions, but to see how common people can benefit, poor people can benefit, and then it becomes a voting issue. And it becomes an issue if the key candidates, the senators, the MPs in India are not on the right side, they get voted out. Because there is nothing as big as political power. I mean, private sector can do its thing, but it's not good enough to the scale we are achieving. So what is the appeal to this group? I think there might be some innovation on how to engage public through social media or otherwise on issues of climate in the political process. I mean, I'm kind of laying out this more broadly. So for example, if there are those tools of media have been applied to other fields, but I think it's very important to think about innovation of how do you actually link the two. And what there is policy questions that Holmes has been working on is to basically get to address those consumers who are going to be disqualified and bring them into the process. But say, for example, in India, like just to take you to a completely different context, right? So I'll give you an example of a kind of political economy disruptor. So a lot of times the issue of clean energy is kind of considered an elite issue, and the transition is considered infeasible. So one idea that we are working on is that there is significant amount of drought in India due to climate change that is already happening. There is significant issue of farmer suicides because of their lands are being destroyed. So we are working on identifying like 1,000 gigawatts of solar potential on drought-prone lands, and how can you actually devise a system where the farmer gets a share of the solar revenue, and their political economy, their interests are in fact aligned with rapid development of solar power on their lands, because their lands are not producing as much stuff because of climate change. And our analysis shows that even a 10% surcharge on solar power can double their income on those lands. So there might be 10 such disruptive ideas, but we shouldn't just look in the sphere of technology. The problem is not technology. The problem is really the political economy. So that's the answer to your question of how fast can we move. I think how fast can we vote out the politicians who kind of don't believe or don't want to do this.
Yeah, that was a great response. Holmes, do you have anything to add?
Having worked with policymakers, and myself even had a very short stint, courtesy of the National Science Foundation, of working in Beijing at the Energy Resource Institute, I've had the opportunity to meet with policymakers at admirably high levels of position. And in every case, they are extremely aware of the science of the situation and the urgencies that we face. But they're also people who are creatures of a kind of Machiavellian power calculation that is constantly compelling them to do things that make sure that they can maintain authority. And so in some ways, we have allowed the consolidated interests of our incumbent energy vendors to distort their frame of decision-making, where they may want to make sure that the economy is sound, stable, and sustainable for all people everywhere for all time. But if it means that they will lose the next election or the next round of appointments and never be able to make another decision on any issue that any of their constituents care about, that's a price to pay that's too high. And for that reason, work by the historian of science, Naomi Oreskes, is very instructive, where she's been able to document the types of tactics of disinformation and intimidation that are directed towards decision makers at every level in order to deter them from demonstrating the kind of leadership that Amol is admirably calling for. But of course, that's also what brings forward a civic response, where people who are trying to contest the illegitimate use of consolidated power in the marketplace are essentially applying that pressure in a political way to say, if you think a company is going to take you out of office, we will actually take you out first. And that's the kind of threat that moves people forward.
Yeah, great points, all of you. And so I know we're at time, but if we are able to sort of address one more question, if folks are able to stay on, there are just some great ones coming through here, and I can also capture and send them up in a follow-up email. But and so thanks, Holmes, for addressing Alyssa's question about what businesses can do to pressure policymakers. And I just want to see if anyone has thoughts on this question of from Liam about examples of policymakers and the political process, or countries where people are talking about the idea of scaling back the demand for energy, moving away from high energy intensive activities. I think this is definitely more of a developed world, like something that's placed at the footsteps of developed countries, or is the mantra still about clean growth of all activities? Yeah, and Cecilia mentioned the degrowth. We had a whole fireside chat about growth versus degrowth, and it was sort of fascinating, but left a lot of unanswered questions. I don't know a lot of great examples of this, but anyone want to address reducing demand for energy in as part of the clean energy transition?
I would address that, yes, it is. I think not just from energy efficiency perspective, but from a conservation perspective. And this is where I am personally cynical about it, meaning that we as humans are pretty selfish. I don't think unless we fix this from a political economy and technology perspective, we don't stand a chance. But I could be dead wrong. And this is where innovation takes us to surprising places. If somebody had told Mahatma Gandhi that you're going to overthrow British power by non-violent protests and by the British are beating up India, nobody would have believed it, right? So this is where I'm not going to say this won't work, but I think conservation, efficiency have a great place. I think some innovation could happen on that, on social status of being a minimalist or being a vegetarian or a vegan. There are innovation that could happen, but I'm cynical, but I would love to be wrong, because there are so many examples in history where the massive changes actually happened from things that were not anticipated.
Yeah, great
And
point.
I might add that I think it depends on, if your question is asking who are we asking to use less energy, I think that really matters. And I take a lot of issue with the idea of the onus of climate mitigation being placed on the individual. And I think that Naomi Oreskes, the scholar that Holmes mentioned, has detailed how this has been somewhat of a strategy on the part of fossil fuel companies to point out that it's up to the consumer to do this work. And I think that is just not fair and not equitable for a lot of reasons. And that's why our discussion has covered civic engagement and systems change. It's not up to us to live like minimalists because it's our burden to do this. There has to be a collective systems change so that everybody can access the resources that they want through a transformed system. But that's very difficult, and that gets back to the timeline question.
Yeah, great points. So I want to kind of wrap things up. I think I will capture some of these last questions from Florian, Nikhil, and those two, and just kind of send them up in my follow-up email. But I just want to thank you all so much for being here. This has been a super informative and just enlightened and passionate conversation, and I'm excited to share this with the few folks who were like, oh, we can't be here, but we need to see what is happening. I know I also am already looking forward to rewatching this, and just really appreciate all of your time, and any ways that you want to continue to engage with our Terra community and our Terra fellows, I'm sure would be greatly appreciated. So thank you all.
It was a privilege to be invited, Lainey. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
All right.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Thanks.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Amol.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone.